Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about institutional knowledge, which is sometimes called tribal knowledge, but I don't like that name, tribal knowledge. It doesn't really capture what I'm trying to say here. And institutional knowledge I will define as things you're expected to know when you work at a particular company and on particular projects, but they're not written down. I had been planning this talk for about a week when I put up a video called RPG Features Nobody Asked For, and one of the commenters, Scorbusas, mentioned this very thing about, hey, do you think some of these RPG features keep getting put in because of loss of institutional knowledge? And I said, yes, they do. And in fact, I'm planning to talk about it. So let's talk about it here. And before I even start, let me just point out that institutional knowledge is different from like preservation. Even I'm talking about like it's stuff that's not written down and should have been, but I don't mean game preservation. I've done videos on game preservation. I link them below. This is a different thing. This is things, like I said, they're things you're expected to know, but they aren't written down anywhere. And before we even dive into what these things are, let's talk about why wouldn't people write them down? If these things are so important, why aren't they written down? And let me just tell you, there's a bunch of reasons. I've heard all of these over the years, and I still hear them now, so let's break it down. The big reason people don't write down institutional knowledge is because everybody knows it. You know, you come to work at a company and everybody just knows, oh yeah, this is how we do things. This is the kind of games we make. And when we make those games, they tend to have this tone. We tend to treat dialogue this way. And we tend to do this in combat. And we like to have this as our themes. It's just everybody knows it. Why would you have to write it down? That's like constantly mentioning to someone that the sun is yellow or water's wet. And some of you told me water isn't wet. Feels wet. Anyway, everybody knows this, so why would you write it down? That's a huge reason institutional knowledge is just never documented. But another reason is it seems obvious. To everyone working there, some of these things just seem like straightforward and everybody knows this. If it's almost like I've done videos where I've mentioned talking about making a prototype or a vertical slice or working with publishers, and I'll throw out either a term or something in a stage of the game, and people ask me about it. So I ended up making a lot of videos that I considered very foundational, but I've known them for so long, it didn't even occur to me that I was using terms and talking about things that most people don't know about because they're just so completely like embedded in my brain that to me they're obvious. And people feel this way about a lot of institutional knowledge. Why would I write this down or even talk to people about it? Everybody knows it. It's obvious. It's a given. Can we move on to something more important? Another reason institutional knowledge isn't documented is there's a lot of it. Just a lot of it. There's a ton of things that are integral to making a particular kind of game at a certain company, and because there's so much of it, some of it just didn't get written down because it was overlooked. You know, you wrote down, maybe you did write down like 100 things people have to keep in mind when they make a non-linear, goal-oriented open world RPG here, and you left one out. And then later on people go, I can't believe this isn't part of this documentation. Well, guess what? There were just too many things to go through, and that one got overlooked. The fourth reason things don't get written down is a really bad one, and I ran into this a lot. And what happens is there are some people who consider that institutional knowledge their own knowledge. They're like, hey, this is mine. I'm not going to share this with people. This is like half my job is knowing these things. Why would I tell people these things and then they can do my job? I ran into this a lot. Back at Interplay when I was working on GNW, GNW, I've got a whole video about it. It's linked below. A lot of programmers had their own routines for things that GNW did, like, blitting pixels to the screen or reading mouse coordinates not in screen coordinates, but in their own, like the mouse has moved and the movement was registered in Mickeys, certain Mickeys in X and certain Mickeys in Y, which were independent of whatever screen resolution you were in. A lot of programmers already knew how to do this and they had their own routines to do this, and they didn't share it because these are things they wrote themselves and they considered it their own personal toolkit. In fact, when I started working on GNW, I had an executive at Interplay tell me I was wasting my time because no one would use it. And guess what? He was wrong. A lot of people used it, especially as we hired new programmers. And they would say, hey, does anybody have a way of initializing super VGA modes or writing to them that work on with bank switching and all these other things? And I'm like, yeah, I do. Here's one. I have a library that does that. And guess what? It's trivial to initialize, and it's documented and everything. And tons of them started using it. And I had one programmer come up to me one day and go, why are you doing this? That could be your own tool chest. You're letting these other programmers get a jump start. And I'm like, because we're trying to make games. I'm not trying to be the best programmer here. I'm trying to make games. And these people are trying to make games too. Isn't that what we're all doing? And that's when I realized a lot of people, their own personal self-worth matters more than anything else. And not to name names, but I've worked with people who their own self-worth is more valuable than the game they're making. They would rather make a bad game as long as what they do is really good and would look good on a resume. Anyway, that's a digression, but that's an explanation of why some institutional knowledge isn't shared. But then the last reason is probably, and maybe the most common, on why some institutional knowledge isn't shared, but it certainly is a really important one. And that's because some institutional knowledge is hard, or I would even dare say impossible, to verbalize. It is just an ineffable quality of the games being made that you kind of know, but it's hard for you to tell people, and here's how you do it. By the way, I've got a video on why definitions are hard. I talk about how to define a cup in it. And I said that's why game directors are so important, because ultimately when some of these things come up, you have to make a decision. Does this feature belong in the game? Does this dialogue sound right? Does this kind of creature belong in the world? Sometimes it goes up to the game director and not the lead artist or lead designer or lead programmer who may be like, I don't want to code that. It's up to the game director to make that final decision and go, yes, this thing belongs in the game. We need to have this. So now that I've given you all the reasons, why something may not be written down, let's talk about some of the things that are institutional knowledge and are hard to write down. And most of them, I think, there are a couple things. Usually it's a process. It's how is something made, or how is it finished? How's you have the basic thing working, but how do you make it polished and ready to ship? How do you even get it into the game? What are all the stages you have to go through? Who are all the different people that have to be involved? What are things you have to think about? These processes can be very, very complex. Sometimes they involve lots of different people because, especially these days, getting a 3D model made, you have a modeler and a rigger and a texture and an animator, and these are all different people often. So it's a complex process, and sometimes it's hard to find one person who could write down the entire process there. Sometimes it involves people who aren't at the company. If you make a console game, eventually it has to pass their certification board. And those aren't people at your company, and they will look at your game and go, oh, you have this in there, or you didn't do this thing that we require you to do. And you want to have that written down somewhere, so when you're making the game, you don't make a game that makes it hard or impossible to do that thing that they require. So sometimes processes are so complex, things get missed when they're written down. Also, part of the complexity is things branch. Sometimes in a process, you have two different things that can be done, and it depends on the exact feature you're making or the exact asset you're putting in the game to decide which side of that process you go to. Maybe sometimes that's left out. So people are like, I followed the written process. Oh, it doesn't apply to that particular kind of asset. Or maybe one of those branches is optional. You don't have to do it, but you should know why the option is there and when you want to execute it. And maybe that decision information, maybe the branch is there, but they didn't document why you would choose that branch of the process. And so maybe because of the optional branching, you're like, oh, I thought I had to do that. No, you didn't have to, and you shouldn't do it all the time. And that ultimately comes to what I talked about in that video on definitions of hard and why you need a director. Is sometimes you just need a judgment call. Maybe you've hit a branch, maybe it's an option, or maybe there's a part of the process that's really hard to step through, and you need someone there who can make a judgment and go, this is what we're going to do. This is how it works. This is what we're going to do. And usually that's the game director. Sometimes it's the lead or the director in that area. The art director makes a decision, or the programming director makes a decision. So those are a lot of reasons that processes can be very hard to document and sometimes don't get documented. But the other one is is the ineffable thing I talked about, that that an institutional knowledge sometimes isn't written down because it's just so hard to describe it. Usually this is a tone. Like games made at a certain company have a tone. Maybe you think of it as their humor. Maybe you think of it as their style. And style could be anything. Style could be the art style, the user interface style, the mechanics you come to expect from that company. You just like, oh, I like this company because I like how I can use skills and dialogue. Or I like that they have lots of different guns and skills to use guns and a variety of different kinds of guns. You may just grow to enjoy that particular kind of style from the game. So it will throw you off if it's not there. And that leads me to kind of like what the point of this whole thing is, why I'm describing institutional knowledge and why it's hard to document and why it sometimes doesn't get documented, is usually games from a particular company or from a person or a set of people that you've grown to associate with the games you like. Those games have a particular feel and you grow to expect that feel. And sometimes a game will come out from a person or company and you're like, that doesn't seem like everything else they've ever made, and something's off. Maybe it's just you. Maybe there's some small little feature that you've grown to expect and it isn't in their game, and everybody else is loving their game and you're like, I don't like this. And that's because that one feature is missing. But in a bigger scale, especially when you see a lot of people going, this is not the game we expected, it's because there's been a loss of institutional knowledge at that company. So the feel of these games are shifting. They're making different kinds of games, different style, different humor, different tone. And it's not what you expected. And it's because all of the knowledge and processes and information flow that led to that style of game is no longer at that company. It's not written down, and the people who knew it aren't there anymore. And this is happening a lot more recently because there's been a lot of layoffs, but also people like me who've been in the industry for a long time are starting the retirement process, which is a new thing for the industry. The industry isn't old enough to have a lot of people retiring in it yet, but it's starting to happen, and it's going to happen more and more. And I think those two factors, lots of layoffs, people retiring, when you throw it into the natural thing that people move and shift from company to company just because they're either looking for a better fit or better pay or they want to live somewhere different, those three things contribute to the loss of institutional knowledge. And institutional knowledge, then, that loss makes these games feel different. And I think a lot of you are feeling that because you're playing games either in a series, you buy something, the third or fourth in a series, or you buy another game from a company because you've grown to like and expect certain things and then you don't get it. And I think a lot of this can be explained by loss of institutional knowledge. Anyway, I hope that helps you understand why games change.